The young and the restless spoilers. Alan's life had always been a chaotic blend of internal turmoil and unpredictable bursts of aggression. Known to some as Martin, a name he'd long ago adopted as a disguise for his darker impulses, Alan's condition had worsened over time. His past was marred by a history of mental illness, a legacy that festered beneath the surface, twisting his perceptions and distorting his reality. When faced with overwhelming pressure, Alan would retreat into the shadows of his mind, a silent predator waiting for the next opportunity to inflict pain. In his isolated apartment in a nondescript suburb, Alan's fragile sanity teetered on the edge. He had spent countless nights battling inner demons, unable to reconcile the duality of his existence. The chaos inside him was not always visible to the outside world, but those who had known him, if only for a moment, felt an inexplicable chill at the mention of his name. Whispers among acquaintances spoke of his eerie transformation when stress mounted, as though the familiar persona dissolved into something far more menacing. Tracy was the next unwitting victim in this tragic spiral. A gentle soul with an earnest desire to help, she had tried repeatedly to reach out to Alan, sensing the storm that brewed within him. She believed that if she could just offer him a word of reason, a moment of solace, perhaps he would choose a different path. Tracy's advice was simple yet heartfelt. Alan, please, try to remain calm. Let's not do anything that we'll regret later. However, Alan's distorted mind misinterpreted her concern as a ploy to have him locked away, imprisoned by a system that could never truly understand the depth of his suffering. That fateful evening, the tension in the cramped living room was palpable. Rain drummed relentlessly against the window panes, mirroring the tempest in Alan's heart. Tracy, with her soft voice and gentle demeanor, attempted once more to calm him down. Alan, I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because I care. You need to trust me, she pleaded, her eyes searching his face for any sign of lucidity. But Alan was beyond reasoning. In his troubled mind, her words had become twisted echoes, confirming his worst fears. You want to send me to jail, don't you? He hissed, his voice low and trembling with a mix of paranoia and rage. The room, once filled with the possibility of redemption, now pulsed with imminent danger. Their argument escalated rapidly. As each word was exchanged, the distance between sanity and madness narrowed until it snapped under the weight of Alan's spiraling emotions. In a moment of uncontrollable fury, Alan lunged forward. The transformation was swift and horrifying. With an instinct born of years of suppressed anger and pain, Alan's hands found Tracy's throat. In that instant, time seemed to freeze, the sound of her soft protests, the echo of her heartbeat, and the sudden silence as life slipped away. Tracy's struggle was brief and tragic. The warmth of her life was extinguished before it could fully bloom, leaving behind an emptiness that would forever haunt the corridors of memory. The room, once a space of possibility, now bore the scars of violence and despair. Tracy lay lifeless, her eyes reflecting the shock and pain of her final moments. Realization hit Alan with the force of a tidal wave. His mind, still clouded by the haze of adrenaline and panic, could not immediately process the enormity of what had transpired. In the aftermath of the act, a primal fear seized him. This was not the resolution he had imagined when he sought solace in isolation. This was a descent into irrevocable darkness. Overwhelmed by the gravity of his actions, Alan bolted from the apartment. His heart pounded as he sprinted through rain-soaked streets, driven by the desperate desire to escape the unfolding nightmare. His plan was to return to Paris. A city that, in his mind, symbolized a life before the madness took hold. The allure of its vibrant streets and whispered promises of normalcy provided a stark contrast to the chaos he had left behind. But as he ran, every step was haunted by the specter of his deed, and every raindrop on his face reminded him of the irreversible moment of violence. Meanwhile, the silence that followed Tracy's death was shattered by the arrival of Jack and Diane. They had come to check on her after sensing something amiss, a foreboding feeling that had grown over the past few days. Their eyes widened in horror as they beheld the scene of devastation. Tracy's lifeless form lay in stark contrast to the otherwise ordinary setting of the apartment, a chilling testament to the brutal confrontation that had taken place. Jack's voice trembled as he tried to piece together the fragments of the unspeakable act. This can't be happening. Who would do such a thing? Diane's face turned pale as the realization dawned on them. They had always suspected Alan harbored a darker nature, a dangerous side that lurked behind a veneer of normality. Yet, nothing had prepared them for the cold reality. Alan was not just troubled, he was capable of murder. As the early investigations began to unfold, Jack and Diane's shock quickly turned to a grim determination. The evidence at the scene, the frantic struggle, the desperate final moments, painted a clear picture. They recognized that this was not an isolated incident of a troubled man losing his temper. It was the culmination of a long-standing internal battle that had now spilled over into irreversible tragedy. While the police cordoned off the apartment and began their methodical investigation, Alan's fate was shrouded in uncertainty. He was on the run, his mind a tumult of regret, fear, and a perverse longing for a past life that might have once been. In his haste to flee, he clung to the hope that Paris would offer a fresh start, a chance to reclaim some semblance of the person he might have been if not for the relentless weight of his own inner demons. In a dark corner of a crowded Parisian street, Alan paused to catch his breath. The city lights twinkled above, indifferent witnesses to the calamity that had followed him across continents. He recalled fleeting memories of happier times, moments before the burden of his mental torment took full control. But with every step he took away from his current life, the memories grew increasingly distant, replaced by the gnawing certainty that there was no escape from what he had become. Jack and Diane, now fully aware of the horror that had unfolded, vowed to bring justice to Tracy's untimely death. Their minds were reeling with a blend of sorrow, anger, and disbelief. They had known Alan was troubled, but they had never imagined that his struggles would lead him down a path so dark and irreversible. As they combed through the evidence, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, each clue a somber reminder of the warning signs that had been ignored. In the weeks that followed, the media began to pick up the story, and the public's shock turned into a fervent demand for answers. Analysts and psychologists debated over Alan's actions, trying to understand how a mind so deeply scarred by mental illness could descend into murder. The narrative quickly evolved from a personal tragedy to a cautionary tale about the dangers of untreated psychological trauma and the failure of a society to recognize the signs of impending disaster. For Alan, however, there was no solace in public opinion. Every headline, every news report, felt like a nail in the coffin of the person he once hoped to be. His escape to Paris was not just a physical relocation, it was an attempt to evade a past that had now become an inescapable prison of guilt and regret. Yet, as he wandered through the winding streets of the city, the weight of his actions pressed down on him relentlessly. In every shadow, he saw the ghost of Tracy, and in every quiet moment, he was forced to confront the terrible truth of his own nature. In the end, the tragedy that began with a series of internal battles and misinterpreted intentions left a trail of irrevocable consequences. Tracy's death was a stark reminder of how fragile life can be when caught in the crossfire of inner demons and unchecked despair. And though Alan had once sought refuge in the hope of reclaiming his old life in Paris, he now found himself at the mercy of a relentless past, a past that would forever haunt him as the man who, under the guise of Martin, committed an act of unthinkable violence. Jack and Diane continued their pursuit of justice, driven by the need to ensure that Tracy's memory would not fade into oblivion. They, along with the community and the authorities, vowed that such a horror would not be forgotten, and that steps would be taken to prevent another tragedy born out of mental anguish and miscommunication. Their resolve became a rallying cry, a call for a deeper understanding of mental health, for compassion in the face of despair, and for a vigilant society that could recognize and intervene before the darkness consumes another soul. Thus, in the echo of that dreadful night, the story of Alan, Martin, and Tracy served as both a somber warning and a catalyst for change. It reminded all who heard it that beneath the surface of every troubled mind lies a potential for both profound sorrow and irreversible action. And in that delicate balance, the choices made in moments of crisis could irrevocably alter the course of countless lives. When Alan's eyes fluttered open after the horrifying events that had unfolded, a cold realization crashed over him: there was no turning back. The adrenaline still surged through his veins as fragments of the night's unspeakable act, the suffocating grip on Tracy's throat, her silent pleas, and the final, tragic silence swirled in his mind. But in that disorienting moment, a darker truth emerged. This was not simply the fraught mind of Alan anymore. The man now standing in the desolate aftermath was, in fact, Martin, a persona he had long embraced in his desperate bid to survive. For years, Martin had been a ghost in the shadows, a master of evasion and cunning. Where Alan once wore his heart on his sleeve, vulnerable and haunted by guilt, Martin had learned to hide, to blend into the urban tapestry of broken dreams and forgotten promises. Now, with the grim murder of Tracy weighing heavily on his conscience, Martin understood that his time was limited. He knew that he could not possibly outrun fate for long. The relentless pursuit of the law was already closing in. The police, tipped off by frantic calls and mounting evidence, were now scouring every dark alley and deserted street, determined to capture the culprit. But Martin, unburdened by the crippling terror that had once paralyzed him as Alan, merely grinned at the challenge. In his mind, the constant game of hide-and-seek was something he had perfected over the years, a survival skill honed to near perfection. His next move was as calculated as it was daring. Martin would assume a completely new identity, leaving behind a life rife with secrets and torment. His destination? Genoa, a city that, with its labyrinthine streets and bustling energy, promised a perfect stage for his reinvention. Genoa would be his sanctuary, a new beginning where he could start afresh under a name that was not tarnished by the horrors of his past. Yet there was another, even more audacious twist to his plan. Martin had a twin, Alan, who, until now, had borne the brunt of every misfortune and every echo of guilt. In Martin's twisted logic, the blame for Tracy's death would be shifted entirely onto Alan. This was not merely an escape, it was a calculated act of betrayal, a fratricidal gamble to free himself from the relentless specter of his sins. With every step he took toward Genoa, Martin meticulously set the stage to frame Alan, ensuring that when the authorities eventually caught up, they would have no choice but to lock the innocent twin away for a crime he did not commit. As the city lights of his current hideout blurred into the background, Martin set about his transformation. He meticulously erased all traces of his past identity, altering documents, fabricating alibis, and even altering his physical appearance with the help of underground contacts. Each night, as he sat in dimly lit rooms far from the prying eyes of the law, Martin rehearsed his new story. In every detail, he ensured that his narrative was as airtight as the evidence that would soon point to his twin. His mind, sharp and unyielding, envisioned the moment when the police would seize Alan in Genoa, and he would vanish into the obscurity of a new life. Despite the cold rationality of his plan, a storm of emotions churned within him. There was a bitter taste of regret and sorrow for the irreversible act that had set these events in motion. Yet, in Martin's eyes, those emotions were mere obstacles to his survival, hurdles to be overcome in the pursuit of self-preservation. He had learned long ago that mercy and remorse were luxuries he could ill afford in a world that had shown him only cruelty and betrayal. The days leading up to his departure were filled with a dangerous tension. Every siren in the distance, every unexpected knock on the door, heightened his resolve to keep moving. The once familiar city where he had hidden in plain sight now seemed to conspire against him, its every corner a potential trap laid by the unyielding hand of justice. Yet, Martin had an uncanny ability to navigate through chaos. With the meticulous planning of a seasoned escape artist, he severed all ties to his former life, confident that his elaborate scheme would be his salvation. However, as Martin's departure drew near, a shadow of an even darker possibility began to creep into his thoughts. He had not yet carried out the final part of his plan, eliminating the one person who could potentially unravel everything, his twin brother Alan. Though it pained him in ways he dared not admit, Martin realized that Alan remained a liability. If left unchecked, Alan might inadvertently reveal the truth behind the facade, or worse, attempt to reconcile the fractured pieces of their shared past. And so, Martin had resolved that the time to deal with Alan would be upon his arrival in Genoa. He knew that in the midst of a massive police crackdown, his twin would be easy prey for the law, a perfect scapegoat for the tragedy that had unfolded. The fateful journey to Genoa was shrouded in uncertainty. As Martin boarded the train that would carry him away from the chaos of his former life, he felt a cold detachment settle over him. The rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks served as a grim reminder of the inescapable march of time. In his mind, every mile was a step further away from the guilt that had once defined him, and a step closer to the freedom he so desperately craved. Arriving in Genoa, Martin prepared for the final act of his master plan. In the dim light of early morning, he navigated the ancient, winding streets of the port city, each turn a deliberate move in the chess game of his existence. It was here that he intended to orchestrate the ultimate betrayal, ensuring that every trace of evidence, every whispered rumor, would point unerringly to Alan. The plan was simple in its cruelty: let the authorities apprehend Alan, while Martin slipped into the shadows, blending into the anonymity of a new identity and a new life. But fate, as it so often does, began to murmur warnings in the recesses of Martin's mind. Was it possible that in his desperate bid to escape, he was merely trading one prison for another? The question gnawed at him as he watched the police presence in Genoa swell with each passing hour. The intricate web of his deception was teetering on a fragile balance. A single misstep could unravel everything he had worked for, plunging him into a nightmare from which there might be no escape. The tension reached a fever pitch on the day Martin's final act was to be executed. In a crowded square near the harbor, beneath a sky that seemed to weep for the sins of the past, Martin moved with the silent determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. He met with a trusted contact, a shadowy figure with the means to discreetly alter records and erase his digital footprint, while keeping a wary eye on the perimeter. Every detail was scrutinized, every possibility accounted for. Yet, amid the calculated precision, an undercurrent of anxiety pulsed through him. He wondered if the authorities had caught wind of his plan, if somehow, the truth of his dual existence would come crashing down upon him. As dusk approached, Martin found himself standing at the precipice of his destiny. The question loomed large: would his plan succeed, or would the relentless pursuit of justice finally claim him? In the echo of distant sirens and the murmur of restless citizens, Martin's heart pounded with a mix of hope and dread. In that moment, the weight of every decision, the lives shattered, the trust betrayed, and the identity stolen, settled upon him like an unbearable burden. Only time would reveal whether Martin's intricate scheme, built on deception and the misfortune of his twin, would allow him to escape the long arm of the law and begin anew, or whether fate would finally deliver the reckoning he had so desperately tried to avoid. The fate of Alan? And, by extension, the dark secret that was Martin hung in the balance, poised between the relentless forces of justice and the desperate will to survive.